Well, so good to be with you all this morning. My name is Tim Howard, and I am the director of groups here at our church. And I'm so excited to be able to be with you guys, continuing on in the Rise and Fall series. We've been going through the story of First and Second Samuel. And I'm also really excited to be able to be with you guys on the week of Thanksgiving. I don't know about you. I mean, obviously, Christmas is the top tier holiday, right? Especially as a Christian. But I think sometimes Thanksgiving doesn't get its due, right? Like people are already putting up the lights. I have no problem with that. Like I'm pro already putting up the lights, but don't let it get buried. Don't let Thanksgiving get lost. You guys are like, why is he reviewing holidays right now? Like we're here to hear a sermon. But I love Thanksgiving, and just no joking. I love a week where we get to stop and just be thankful for all of the things that God's given us, the life that he's given us, just as we should every single day. But one of the stereotypes that comes along with Thanksgiving, right, is I'm sure you've seen it in movies and TV shows. It's this picture of a family that's sitting down around the table. Several of the family members maybe haven't seen each other in a few years. You know what I'm talking about. And like the tension is high because you got the one family member where everyone's kind of like biting their nails, like, oh no, if he says something that this other guy disagrees with, like the conversation grenade's going to get thrown out into the middle of the table, and so everyone's kind of on the edge of their seat. And that kind of ties into what we're talking about today, because here, whenever we pick up in 2 Samuel in the life of David, we are now 16 years after where we were last week at the story of David and Bathsheba. And today we're going to be kind of talking about several themes that saying family tension is a bit of an understatement. I'm just going to be really honest with you guys. One of the things I love about the Bible, and one of the things that's really hard about the Bible at the same time, those two things can be true at the same time, is that it does not ever sugarcoat the world that we live in, right? I don't know about you, but sometimes growing up in the church, I had a picture of Christianity that is just happy-go-lucky all the time, and the Bible does not sugarcoat the effects that sin has on this world, right, and what it's done to us. And we're going to be covering some themes today that, I'm be honest, I didn't get out of bed this morning and go like, yes, I get to talk about this in front of 200 people. Let's go. But we're going to be talking about themes of sexual assault, murder, one family member having a very inappropriate desire towards another family member. I'll let you fill in the blanks of what that means, as well as family alienation, family members not talking. And I'll be honest, for me and for many of you in there, several of these themes might be a bit triggering because you may have been through them yourself. And so I today do not want to make light of that, but we're going to go straight into the heart of it because there's a thread that we have to catch in this story. It's this little moment. But if we miss this moment, I think we're missing something that's huge that God wants us to grasp, that not only changes the way that we walk with him, but also changes the way that we even view his love towards us for the rest of our entire life. And that's a pretty big statement. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into where we're at today. And in order to move forward in the story, we have to move backwards just briefly to kind of recap where we were. So last week we were in 2 Samuel, chapter 11 through 12. And, we saw David in the story of Bathsheba. And several of us have heard this story before, right? But I think the thing that Clay did such a good job portraying is this fact that David gave into the desires of his sinful flesh, of what it desired, which was to pursue a married woman. And he pursued her, and he had her husband killed indirectly, right? And, he failed big time. But the crazy thing in that story is God's massive grace that he pours out to David. It's just unbelievable grace that even after all of that, that David turns to God and says, God, I'm so sorry. And in his heart, he grieves for what he did genuinely and deeply. And God gives him grace. And so here's a reality, is God's grace good? Absolutely. Does he extend it to us freely and all the time? Absolutely. But are there natural consequences for things that we do that are outside of God's will? 100% yes. Right? And so Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 through 8, I think give us kind of a good bedrock for today. Picking up in the New Testament, do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Whoever sows to please their flesh, from the flesh will reap destruction. So there's just a reality with sin that the things that we do that are outside of the way that God has designed things to work and the way that God has designed us to have relationship with Him, it hurts us, right? Like if I am outside of God's will and I go and wreck my car in the process, can God forgive me? Absolutely, and He is so gracious and willing to do that. But do I have to go find a new car? Yes, absolutely, I do. And here's the way that I just want to say this out loud. This is a little bit off the beaten path, but I just have to say it. The way that we view sin sometimes is inadequate. Because the way that we view it is it's just doing bad things, right? Like, we don't need to do bad things to be a good Christian. We need to do good things. And to say that that is not what God desires is an understatement. Because the reality of sin is it's not just bad stuff that we do. It's the condition of our heart where we do not put God at the center. We commit sin anytime in our heart there's something else in the center of our loves and motivations more than God. And it begins there, right? And sometimes the way I view it is it's like there's all this fun stuff that God's trying to keep from me, right? But to be a good person, I've got to stay on this path, right? It's almost like there's a pantry with a jar of cookies up at the top, and God's like, hey, don't grab those, And that's the way we view it. And it's like, well, maybe if I can climb up there while God's not looking and I can grab one out, then if He doesn't catch me with my hand in the cookie jar, everything will be okay. But here's the reality is that, one, we don't take into account that the lights are already off in the pantry and we can't see what we're doing. And second, we're too short to see what's in it. It's like we're like a little kid and we climb up there and we can't see what we're grabbing. We're like, I'm going to get the cookie. And God's like, that's not a cookie, that's rat poison that was in there the whole time. And I wasn't telling you that to keep you from fun. I was telling you that because, my child, I love you. I love you. And that's always God's heart towards us. And so before we even jump into the story, we have to reframe the way we view sin from the jump. And so today we're going to be in 2 Samuel chapters 13 through 19. It's a pretty big chunk of scripture, so I'm not going to read the entire thing, or we would be here until Thanksgiving Day. But we're going to be hitting the highlights today to help us get an overall picture of what God is saying here. And there's a few characters we need to get straight. Obviously we have King David, but now 16 years later, there's 3 of his children that are in this story. We have his oldest son, Amnon, right? Amnon's the oldest son, and that's from a marriage previous to Bathsheba. And then we have 2 children that are from his marriage to Bathsheba, and that is Absalom, his other son. Right? So Amnon, Absalom, right? Little similar. And then we have Tamar, his daughter. And in this story, we start out with Amnon. We're just going to jump right into the thick of it. Amnon is having inappropriate desires for his half-sister Tamar. And that's where we're picking up. And he has allowed these thoughts and these desires to go unchecked for so long that they're festering and festering and festering. And upon receiving some really terrible advice, he acts upon those feelings, and I'm not even going to sugarcoat it for you guys. He forces himself upon her, and that's where we're going to just start out. I know it's kind of a crazy place to start out, but we have to jump right into it. So this is Tamar speaking in 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 12 through 15. She says, "No, my brother," she said to him, "don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing. What about me? Where could I get rid of my disgrace? And what about you? You would be like one of the wicked fools in Israel. Please speak to the king. He will not keep me from being married to you." But he refused to listen to her. And that's not where that verse actually ends. So I'll let you fill in the blanks what he does. Now, in verse 20, her brother Absalom, so Tamar's full-blooded brother, the other brother that's not Amnon, he says to her, "Has that Amnon, your brother, been with you? Be quiet for now, my sister. He's your brother. Don't take this thing to heart." And Tamar lived in her brother Absalom's house, a desolate woman. When King David heard all this, he was furious. And Absalom never said a word to Amnon, either good or bad. He hated Amnon because he had disgraced his sister Tamar. Now, a couple of things that we pick up right out of the gate in this story is that it says right here that Absalom stands towards the sin as he's very upset of what has happened to his sister, what Amnon has done. But Absalom says, "Hey, be quiet for now, sister, he's your brother. Like he's already kind of saying like let's keep this thing under wraps. And I think one of the things that the Bible omits here, but I think it purposely omits, is that it says when King David heard all this, he was furious. But then what does he do? Right? He doesn't enact justice. He doesn't really say anything about it. And Absalom never says a word to Amnon either. And a theme that we're going to keep seeing today over and over is that David's strategy of sweeping his son Amnon's sin under the rug doesn't work. And this is a big theme, is that sin that is kept in the dark grows in the dark. All right, the intentions and motives we have in our heart that God is not in the center of, that we put under the rug, they don't just stay there. They get bigger. Like if the stage behind me, if this little carpet square right here was like on fire, and as I was teaching, like this, I imagine the first couple of rows would start standing up and pointing, and everyone would start rustling around. And if I just said, okay, oh yeah, for sure, and I just threw a towel on top of it, and just kept talking to you guys, and then now the towel's on fire, and it's bigger, like added kindling to it, and the whole stage is now on fire, everyone in here would have a problem with that. But and obviously so, but in our own lives, we don't. That's what we do. We're just like, I'll just sweep that one under there, thinking that it's going to continue to stay that big, but it always continues to grow and continues to fester. And so now in the story, we're going to, in verse 28, we're now jumping forward 2 years. So this is now 2 years after what had just happened, and Absalom has been festering on his anger towards his brother, and it's kind of come to a head now. And so we pick up, Absalom orders his men, listen, when my brother Amnon is high in spirits from drinking wine, and I say to you, strike Amnon down, then kill him. Don't be afraid. Haven't I given you this order? Be strong and brave. So Absalom's men did to Amnon what Absalom had ordered. Then all the king's sons got up, mounted their mules, and fled. So Absalom has his men kill Amnon, and then they all run away. So at this point in the story now, David has lost a son to murder from his other son who murdered him, and then also his son Absalom has run away. So he's without 2 sons. And he's grieving. But the story points out that for 3 years, King David does nothing regarding Absalom. He doesn't call for him. He doesn't try to bring him close. He is feeling these emotions, but he does not give them a voice. He does not act. Right? And after those 3 years, he finally misses his son so much that he invites Absalom back to Jerusalem. But again, he doesn't see him for 2 more years. Get this. I read this. The Bible kind of says this verse for like just a second. It doesn't make a big deal about it, but I'm going to make a big deal about it. Like David puts him basically in like a little shack on the outskirts of town and doesn't go see him for 2 years. And so Absalom is sitting there like, Dad, what are you doing? What are you doing? And so after those 2 years, David and Absalom finally meet again, and David's so excited to see him. The circumstances that brought that about is because Absalom was setting people's crops on fire to get his dad's attention. That's one way to do it, you know. But Absalom's bitterness and anger has festered at this point, even though he has a smile on his face, like, I'm so happy to see you, Dad. Deep down, he has other motives, right? Because his sin, what was swept under the rug, has festered. At this point in the story, Absalom begins to gain a following, kind of on the side. He's smiling to his dad, but behind the scenes, he's convincing people that he's the rightful king of Israel and that his father David shouldn't be on the throne. It should be me. And more and more people begin to agree with him. And a messenger comes to the palace and tells David, hey, your son, you sent him on he sent him on a little vacation. Well, he's about to come back from the vacation, but he's not coming back home to say hi. Like, he has thousands of men, and they're all going to come and take over your palace and try to kill you. And so he returns to Jerusalem and takes over his father's palace. And David and his supporters have to flee before he gets there. He has to go running for his life. One of the things we have to talk about today is like, what's the point of the story? Why are we even talking about it? Well, for all of us in here, one of the big themes today isn't just that what is kept under the rug grows under the rug, but it's also this reality that all of us are going to encounter trials in our life, circumstances in our life where The dream that we had dreamed up in our mind does not come to fruition the way that we hoped it would. At this point in the story, David is about 60 years old. I doubt whenever he was sitting there with his dream journal, he was like, well, I'll retire around 65, and then, my sons will take over the throne. And remember how to go back? I had, in my 20s, I went running for my life whenever Saul was chasing me. Like, I think doing that again would be fun, right? Like, that's not what he was thinking at all. And so you have to understand from David's perspective the amount of grief that he is feeling. His dreams, the way that he thought things were going to go, did not turn out that way. I doubt he thought in his golden years he'd be running for his life from the sword of his own son with his other son dead. And for all of us, we're going to encounter these trials in our lives, these circumstances in our life. I'll be really honest with you. I've mentioned it a little bit before, but the last 2 years for my wife and I, we encountered some trials where in the pit of our heart, we're like, God, are you even there and are you good? And that's the most honest question sometimes you can ask yourself. But there's something so key here in the story that we have to see, that David's response to this, right? Because one of the things I also love about the Bible is that in the Psalms, we get to see David's first-person perspective. We get to literally read his journal. And in Psalm chapter 3, it literally starts with this tag, a psalm of David when he fled from his son Absalom, right? That makes it a bit more real. These aren't just fairy tale characters. This is a real person who actually experienced these things before God, right? And how in the world, after all of that, could he have this heart towards God? Like, you're good and I still love you. How in the world, how audacious? Let's read what he thinks. What is David's thought here? Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him. But you, Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts my head high. I call out to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy mountain. I lie down and sleep, and I wake again because the Lord sustains me. I will not fear, though tens of thousands assail me on every side. Arise, Lord. Deliver me, my God. Strike all my enemies on the jaw. Break the teeth of the wicked. From the Lord comes deliverance. May your blessings be on your people. That doesn't sound like a man who is downtrodden or discouraged. Well, how in the world? How in the world, right? Even when it looks as if God has abandoned him, David makes the active choice to not abandon God. And how could he do that? How can we do that? Here's the question for us today. How can, even when it looks like everything is stacked against us, God has left us, he's abandoned us. David even mentions that. Like, people are saying, like, your God's left you. But he makes the choice to not abandon God. He pushes all of his chips in on the table, even in the midst of these terrible things that are going on around him, the sins that maybe he's committed, that just being passive, and also just sins of his sons who have affected him now. He's collateral damage of. That's often how it works. Well, as we're about to see, he has this bigger perspective. He has this zoomed out perspective. A few weeks back, we talked about how God gave David this promise. He said, through your family, I'm going to establish a line of kings forever. And David doesn't know the details of how that's all going to work out, but he's been given this promise. And in the midst of such tragedy, he's doubling down on what God has said. And for all of us in this room, it's really no different for us, right? And in some ways, we have the Old Testament and the New Testament. But let's look forward now. Let's go back to 2 Samuel chapter 15, 25 through 26, and pick back up with David. And what we're about to see here, this is just me kind of giving you a big flag. I'm waving it. It's like I talked about that thread at the beginning of this sermon. Here it is. Don't miss it. I'm not going to make it ambiguous. Here it is. Do not miss it. Then the king said to Zadok, Zadok is one of his priests, he says, take the ark of God back into the city. They have the Ark of the Covenant, the golden box with the 12 commandments in it. It's from the Bible. It's not just from Indiana Jones, okay? So if I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it in his dwelling place again. But if he says, I am not pleased with you, then I am ready. All right, so he's literally saying, like, hey, let's send the Ark of the Covenant back in, and if God allows me to go back to Jerusalem, then that's up to him. Look at this next prayer. Look at this next thought. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him. What a posture of surrender in the midst of such tragedy. And how could he have this perspective, right? It's because he knows that in the midst of these trials, it's not God who's left him, man. It's us. We're the ones who've sinned. We're the ones who often don't put God in his proper place. And he knows this, but he also knows the promise that he's been given, that God is going to make things right and establish a line of kings through his family. So he's saying, let him do whatever seems good to him. And then next, in verse 30 of 2 Samuel 15, we get this really crazy little detail that it's like a blink and you'll miss it. Where's he at right now as he's praying this? He was on the run. Where was he? David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. The Mount of Olives, it's this little mountain outside of Jerusalem. And where else have we heard that before, right? Well, this is kind of wild. I'm going to have to do a major time jump here, so just stay with me, okay? So we're going to jump all the way to Luke chapter 22 in the New Testament. Now, this is almost 1,000 years in the future for where David was. And this is Jesus, the Son of God, the night before he's crucified. Right? This is so important. Jesus went out as usual to where? The Mount of Olives, nearly the same mountain. And his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down, and prayed. What was his prayer? "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will be done, but yours be done." Almost the same prayer as David. Jump back just a couple. Let him do whatever seems good to him, right? On the Mount of Olives from David, 1,000 years in the future. "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will be done, but yours be done." And here's the thing about this story is that Jesus, obviously he's praying a really practical prayer. He's praying a legitimate prayer that, hey, tomorrow I'm about to have to go to the cross. And God, is there any way we could do this thing differently? Is there any way I could save mankind in a different way? Because this is going to be very hard. But he's also preaching a message to us that's subtle here. He's praying almost the same prayer that David did 1,000 years earlier. And here's what Jesus is, I think, telling us through modeling that is he's showing that he is the perfection of what David was supposed to be, of what a king was supposed to be. Right? Because David is a man, and he's praying that prayer, but he is filled with sin, and he's made so many mistakes up to this point. He's throwing his cares on God. But here's Jesus, God in the flesh, now coming down to perfect what David was doing. And in our lives, here's the reality, right? We need him to perfect our sins as well. Because before him, because of our sin and our constant propensity to try to put things before God, we need someone to do it for us. And that's what he does, man. That's what Jesus does. And if we just read this story today, if we just read 2 Samuel, I'll be honest, this story kind of ends on a bit of a bummer today. And I just have this picture in my head of leaving it there and being like, okay, go to Jason's Deli or wherever you're going after this, have fun, But we can't miss this. The perfect king came, and he perfected what David was trying to do with his life as the king. And for us, he perfects our souls as well by dying on the cross, rising again, and now he's at the right hand of God. And for all of us who put our faith in him and our trust in him, he's constantly looking at God and saying, no, he's one of ours. I know, but he's growing, and he's one of ours, right? So going back to 2 Samuel chapter 16. So at this point in the story, Absalom takes over Jerusalem, but is disappointed to find his father was not there. Right? He's bummed because he wanted to find his father and kill him. So David, back with his generals still in hiding out in the wilderness, he asks his generals to be gentle with Absalom. They're preparing to go to war, to go back and reclaim the palace, to reclaim Israel. But he's asking his generals, hey, if you find Absalom, please don't hurt him. It just kind of shows David's love for his boy. But they were not gentle. Joab, who is David's first-in-command general, finds David and kills him. And that day in the battle between Absalom's men and David's supporters, 20,000 men died in the battle that day. And the Bible just says that kind of just off the cuff. We've got to highlight that, because here's the reality. It's like sin that was swept under the rug, people being passive, David being passive, Amnon being passive, Absalom being passive. It didn't just affect their family at this point. Sin, the things that we don't confront in our life, man, it has the propensity to cause collateral damage in the lives of others, man. And that's why God, for us, kind of like what we were saying, he's saying like, hey, it's not cookies in the cookie jar that you're trying to reach for. I'm trying to save you. I'm trying to give you an even better life, man. So in this story, this is kind of what I was talking about. It's like I could leave it here, right? David loses both his firstborn son, Amnon, and then the Bible even says Absalom, who's his favorite son. He loses both of them in this story. And David has to go running for his life, literally just as he had 40 years earlier when he was being chased by King Saul. And now at the end of this story, we pick up with him. He's 61 years old, and he doesn't even live another decade after this. He dies at the age of 70. Right? I could be like, all right, let's go home now. And you'd be like, geez, why'd they let him preach? We can't miss this. God's good purpose. In the midst of all of that, David never gave up on God and trusted he would be good in the end, no matter the circumstance. He didn't just have his eyes fixed downward, saying, God, how could you be letting this happen? He has his eyes fixed, so to speak, on God up above in this big picture view of what God is doing. And through David's family, God sent his son Jesus to save us all. Right? That's the gospel. That's the good news. That in the midst of our sin, God was the first mover to come and save us, for those of us who put our hope and our trust in him. And here's the reality in your life. I mean, God's not sending the Savior through you, but here's reality is in the midst of your circumstances and in the midst of your trials, don't miss what God is trying to do in and through your life, because the Bible promises it's bigger and better than what you could even hope or imagine. It's better than what you could want for yourself, is what the Bible promises. So in the midst of what we're going through, man, like I don't want to make light of trials. There's some of you out here that are gone through or going through things that are harder than I could ever imagine or have ever been through or ever will be through. And I don't try to claim to know what it is you're going through. You might be sitting in your chair and you're like, man, like what do you know? And you're probably right. But what I do know is that in the midst of that, God promises that he wants to do more in and through your life than what you could imagine, man. So will you let him? Let's kind of summarize what we talked about today. Right? Sin that is swept under the rug, doesn't stay there. It burns the whole house down. So for all of us, man, who in your life do you have to help drag those things out into the light with? Because that's the antidote. We take them out from under the rug, we bring them before God, and we bring them before trusted friends, and we say like, man, my heart's just not where it should be right now. And other people that are filled with the Holy Spirit of Jesus can look at us and say like, man, I love you where you're at right now. Let's point you to the Lord. It's never shame that causes us to change. It's people around us encouraging us and pointing us to the Lord is how God desires for us to experience real change. So, this is like the group's director's shameless plug. Like if you're not in a small group, and we'd love to connect you, because for me, that's where over the years, ever since I was about 13 years old, that's how I have met the Lord, was through other people constantly saying like, hey man, I hear what you're saying about your life right now, and we're with you in the trenches, but don't lose sight of what he's doing. Don't lose sight of what he's doing. Also, we're going to all encounter trials that change the way we thought our lives were going to go. Right? We're going to make plans. We're going to think that our life's going to turn out one way, but there's going to be things that come out of left field that often change the trajectory of how we thought our lives were going to go. But God is always working for our ultimate good and leading us to Jesus, the perfect King. So I want to go ahead and invite the band back up onto the stage. And as they're preparing behind me, man, like they're about to play a song, and we're going to have 5 or 6 minutes here to reflect. And I think that this song is really fitting for what we're talking about today. And I want you to reflect on a few things. First, I want you to reflect on these prayers. One from King David, one from Jesus, prayed in the same spot, 1,000 years apart, but nearly the same prayer. God, do whatever seems good to you. Yet not my will be done, but yours. How much different do you think your life would be if you started out every day this week, especially in the middle of Thanksgiving? There's a lot of, I know the holidays are great, but also it can be very stressful. If you started out each day this week praying these two prayers, just being in submission to God. God, whatever you want to accomplish through my life, you do it. Right? God, whatever you want to do in and through my life, I hand it to you in submission. And for all of us, right, like we're in the middle of circumstances and trials that are often so hard, and you might feel like your life right now, this song that we're about to sing, it uses the lyric, it describes our life as sometimes being a wasteland, right? Sometimes of poor choices we've made, sometimes of poor choices of others affecting us. Right? But that perfect King, Jesus, he restores. And we live in the middle of this broken world. We live in the middle of a world where, and, you know, it only took 3 chapters in the Bible for sin to enter the picture, right? It didn't even take that long. And in chapter 3 of Genesis, right, like sin enters the picture and we have this disconnected, broken relationship with God. But through Jesus and what he's done, we now have a restored relationship with God. But I don't know if you can sense this, but our world has not yet been restored. The book of Revelation hasn't happened yet where Jesus comes back and makes it all right. So we still live in the Bible, man. And so for you, there's going to be a lyric in this song that appears. And it says that he makes Edens out of wastelands.